I imagine you like to think of yourself as an ethical person, someone who tries to do right and live virtuously. But where did you inherit these principles from? Was it from your parents, or your religious community, or perhaps the culture around you? Or maybe it was all of the above. Unfortunately, most people never really think about how they ground their ethical principles. But some people spend their entire lives in this pursuit. And Aristotle was probably the greatest to ever do it. And that is why today we are taking a look at his monumental work, Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle believed that there is a purpose to life, and that purpose is to aim at the good. He did not believe in just some abstract theory of goodness, like Plato's theory of forms, though. Aristotle believed that the good is rational activity in accordance with virtue. The highest good is what he called eudaimonia, which translates to something like flourishing. We can achieve this eudaimonia by practicing virtue consistently, and yes, I do mean practicing virtue. Aristotle believed that virtue is a skill that can be improved upon in the same way that a musician improves their skill at their instrument through practice. We must combine this practice with our rationality so that we can control our impulses and make virtuous decisions. After all, in Aristotle's eye, rationality is what makes us human. Aristotle divided virtues into two main categories: intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtues are taught to us either by teachers or through study, and moral virtues are learned through practice and habit. Being virtuous is something that we must actively do and not just passively stumble upon. A truly virtuous person will know the right behavior, choose the behavior simply for the sake of doing right, and this need to do right will be a consistent aspect of their character. He also believed that virtuous actions must be done voluntarily. Involuntary actions are ones done under extreme compulsion or purely out of ignorance. Neither of these leave you completely free of guilt, though, especially in the latter instance if you are choosing to remain ignorant. As you can see, free will is very important to Aristotle because one must choose to do good over doing bad. Aristotle then goes on to explain how we might live a virtuous life. Firstly, we must find two opposing extremes of excess and deficiency. From there, we will find a point relatively close to the median between them and apply this behavior within our own lives to see how it actually works in practice. On the screen, I will include a list of Aristotle's virtues and vices so that you can see how this works for yourself. Let me give you an example of how having an excess or a deficiency of a virtue actually leads to vice. If we take a look at courage, which is a virtuous behavior, we can see that the two vices on either side of it are rashness and cowardice. It is virtuous to be courageous enough to save your child when someone attacks them, and it would not be virtuous to be so cowardly that you let your child get hurt in a situation where you could have protected them but were too afraid. However, you can also slip into vice by having too much courage to the point that you act rashly. Let's say that you're a soldier in the First World War. You're sitting in the trenches. Across from you are the enemy's trench lines. You were supposed to launch a heavily planned assault on the enemy the following day to finally deliver that fatal blow and end the war for good. But you're full of piss and vinegar, and you decide that it's better to attack right now. You don't even bother to wait for your comrades to come fight with you. You hop onto the ladder, climb out of the trench, and run full speed at the enemy all by yourself as they aim their machine guns and sniper rifles at you. That would be extremely courageous, but it would only end with you dying and your comrades getting nothing out of the ordeal except the expenses of another body bag. He then moves to discuss justice, which he views as being both lawfulness and fairness. It is important that he adds this discussion on justice to the conversation on virtue, because virtue is in relation to a moral state, and justice is in relation to other beings. Because of this, we can see that the laws must be reasonable and be expected to make the citizens behave better. He subdivides justice into two categories: distributive and rectificatory. Distributive justice means that people get what they deserve, and rectificatory justice is justice that brings back equilibrium if someone has been given less or more than they deserve. This is a bit different than Plato's idea of justice, which is essentially each individual acting out their societal role properly so that the society as a whole is harmonious. Again, injustice is only possible if it is done voluntarily. If it is done under severe pressure or out of pure ignorance, then the perpetrator is not entirely culpable. We then move on to a discussion about the soul. The soul is divided into rational and irrational parts, and the rational part can further be divided into contemplative and calculative parts. The soul is always searching for truth, and there is 5 virtues of how we arrive at the truth. Science allows us to uncover eternal truths. Craft and skill use reasoning. Practical knowledge helps us pursue the good life. Intuition allows us to look at principles, and wisdom allows us to reach the highest truths. He also takes a stance on pleasure, saying that pleasure is an end and not the process, so you can receive pleasure from doing something virtuous, and that does not make it bad, but it also isn't eudaimonia. He closes by saying that people aren't necessarily naturally virtuous, so the state must be there to encourage them to be.